I'm here now with Greg McCarthy, the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Boston, and Michael Watson, the Chief Information Security Officer for the State of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Mike, Greg, good to have you. How are things going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, going well. Thanks for having us.
So today's session, we're talking about footing the bill for cybersecurity. It has been a challenge and an issue as long as I've known each of you. There have been some changes in the last couple of years, and then even more changes in the last couple of months that are changing how we approach this issue. So let's kind of get started, and I'll go to you first, Mike, and then would love to hear from Greg on this. But what is the state of cyber funding right now, and specifically, what's the state of the support funding that you're getting from other entities other than your own government?
Yeah, so I think, we of course are in a time where we understand where cybersecurity is kind of critically important to, functional IT anywhere in our environment, whether it's at private business, public sector, anywhere else. So I think that first part of recognizing where the challenge and problem is something that we've at least made, some pretty decent progress on. We are now at the point of trying to figure out, okay, we understand where some of our funding gaps are. While states in general have been able to, over the last 10 to 15 years, slowly build some of their funding up, we have a lot of our partners and people in our cohorts that are still trying to figure out how to build that up. And I know localities are one of the biggest areas that we understand that there are weaknesses, and we understand that the localities struggle with those funding options because there just aren't enough dollars available, especially at local tax bases, right? It's really difficult to raise those pieces. So we've had some forethought from folks at a number at the state and federal and other levels trying to figure out ways to funnel some of the funding to those organizations to get those basic controls and protections up in place. So we've got, what had been in the past, some of the FEMA, UASI funding. We have some of the pieces coming from the state and local cyber grant program funding. And of course, every state I know is pushing really hard to try to help ways to get funds to locals. I know our current governor approved and legislature approved funding to help even supplement some of what was the matching requirements of some of the grant funds that are out today to try to reduce the burden as much as possible. And I know other states have tried to take similar tacks.
And what are you seeing in Boston, Greg? I mean, Mike has that great purview of that state perspective, but when you get down to the cities, what does it look like for you, even in a big city like Boston?
Yeah, I think funding is always been a challenge. I think with cyber being thought of historically as more of a cost center than really something that brings in money to the organization. I think we've always struggled with trying to rationalize why you should fund a cyber program. What Mike described is similar in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have funding resources through the UASI grant funds. We have funding through state and local cyber grant program. The Commonwealth has also had some grant programs specifically for local municipalities as well. So there's been funding investment. I think one of the challenges, though, is especially for large municipalities, the funds that have been historically allocated under UASI. So for those who are not familiar with UASI, it stands for Urban Area Security Initiatives. And this has been primarily a public safety grant program that was run through FEMA. I believe it was around 2018 was when they first started requiring certain percentage of that grant funding to be spent on cyber initiatives. So there was quite a few years that those funds were requiring spend on cyber initiatives. So in the UASI region for Metro Boston, we did some really amazing programs like invest in the 9 municipalities licensing security awareness training, investing in actually resources that were part of our fusion center that were focused on cyber, resources that would help municipalities in the region assess their cyber needs and then put in for funding requests around those. We also did EDR licensing for the municipalities in the region. So it's been a really great program. what we saw is after the introduction of the state and local cyber grant program, unfortunately, the required spend was taken away from the UASI grant, and we've seen a decrease in that that allocation from that grant funding source, because the thought is you guys have a dedicated cyber grant program, and which is amazing, and I'm appreciative of that program as it is, but it also now spreads the money across the entire state, as opposed to focused on a small group of higher population, higher risk municipalities within a specific state. So it's been quite a challenge.
You know, what I'm hearing there in what both of you are saying is kind of this dilemma that states and cities are facing when it comes to funding cyber. We've talked for years, there's never actually enough money, because you could spend all the money in the world and still not be super secure. But really the dilemma that I'm seeing is that it's not even that there isn't enough money, but you can't even maximize what you've got because of this changing environment. Tell me a little bit more about that. What is that dilemma like in each of your respective places? And Greg, we'll go to you first this time.
Yeah, so I think part of it is, as I mentioned, like the shift from the UASI funding, which our region was heavily part of, and benefited from, to the state and local cyber grant program. I mean, the states are in this extremely challenging situation where they're receiving money on behalf of the local governments, and they have to figure out a way to create a program that can help the smallest of your small towns within your respective state to the more sophisticated, larger urban areas, your cities, and have that equally as valuable across all of those aspects. So it's a really challenging, and I'm not envious of the fact that the states have to figure out how to actually create programs that are diversified across the various or municipalities within their state. So I don't know what the right answer is, but we have seen a big shift in the funding, and I think it's impacting more so the sophisticated or the more well-funded, if you will, cyber programs in local governments. And the state and local cyber grant program is really focused on those smaller municipalities that don't have any resources, that have limited to no level of security, that to just level them up, if you will, to a baseline that is something reasonable.
Yeah, and to that, and I completely agree with Greg's assessment. Like, even in the grant program, there's the funding required to go to the rural folks, with the understanding that they are going to have a tougher time raising those funds that are necessary in order to get them down this path of cyber. And what's the hard part is, like, water systems work to provide water to, it doesn't matter whether it's 20 people or 200 people, like, it's still stuff that needs to get secured to prevent water shortages or power shortages or anything else that is tied to whatever the individual locality is helping to run, or critical infrastructure that locality is providing. And I think the key differences between the two funding approaches previously was, one was tied towards risk, which is a good way to do funding. This state and local cyber grant program is that whole of state, how do I raise everybody to a minimum bar? But that does not necessarily address, negate the requirements for something that's got to be done at that risk level, right? We understand that a water system going out in Boston is going to be different than something that is going out in like southern or southwestern Virginia, where the population densities are just very different, right? And if you were to look at any private organization, people invest in those areas based off of the amount of risk that we're experiencing. And we've got to figure out a way to incorporate, cybersecurity funding, across all of government organizations in that risk-based fashion. I understand that sometimes in government, the risk is different, right? We have to be up when everyone else isn't. Sometimes we have to be ready to respond to, other countries' reactions to the way that we're executing there are different levels of responsibility that are tied to government organizations than what is necessarily tied to the private sector. But it doesn't change the fact that regardless of how we do it, we have to come up with the funding to, put these controls and protections in place, or else when we go to rely on those systems, they're not going to be available. And that's the part that I think we struggle with the most, especially as security practitioners. And I know, Jake, you've seen us do this for years, trying to figure out to say, how do we communicate that, that critical component, when these things aren't working, it means that citizens are impacted, lives are at risk, because that's where government plays, right? It's not like, oh, well, and I shouldn't say this because there's sometimes where this is the case. It's like, not, well, oh, I can't get, my museum entrance today or my whatever today. It's, some law enforcement officers can't function, or, like I said, critical infrastructure can't be provided, water can't be provided, power can't be provided. Those things are no longer possible for citizens. And that's a pretty big life safety issue. And we're constantly trying to remind people of that, so that we are, at least putting the resources where they really need to be. And we're grateful that localities are getting more acknowledgement for where some of that critical infrastructure sits. But it's still a long road. We've got to figure out a way to fund this in the long term, instead of the spurting kind of funding that we're getting now.
And I think in the context of that, like spurting funding, as you say, I mean, it paints a picture of anxiety, right? With the changes to UASI that Greg was talking about, and then now the fact that the state and local cyber grants were kind of a one and done at this point, and eventually that money will run out, and then certainly in early March of 2025, a confusing federal landscape when it comes to funding. What are you guys thinking? Where is this money going to come from? Consistently in the future, if it's not for the feds, how do you make it work just to keep funding what you're trying to fund? And Mike, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, so I'm generally a fan of saying that, state and local government organizations in general are used to being a bit scrappy with their funding, right? We always have to be creative and come up with ways to make sure that whatever agenda that we are trying to support, right? Because that's where we play in technology. We're supporting some sort of business-based agenda, that they're accounting for both the cost for technology and security. The good news is that a lot of the media coverage and stuff that's been out there helps folks understand just how important the cybersecurity aspect of any technology component is, because we've seen the consequences of what happens when it's not there. However, the building in of those funding to support the cybersecurity requirement is always going to continue to be a challenge. And what we try to take, in Virginia, and I know other government organizations have taken the same approach, is saying, like, look, when we release a piece of technology, there is a corresponding cyber thing that goes with it, right? And that cost has to be built into that technology. We've got to make sure we maintain that, and we look at our leaders and those that are setting the budgets to make sure that they're asking that question and say, I know you've got the technology costs in here. Are the cyber costs also accounted for, in this mix? Because if we don't maintain that line, what inevitably happens is we pay more for it later, because we have to then try to retrofit whatever technology that's necessary to keep the cybersecurity stuff working once it's up and running. And that going retrofitting, we all know, trying to put something on later is always way more expensive. Plus, you have to do whatever cleanup it is that for whatever it is that went wrong. So we have to continue to be creative. We have to make sure that our leaders are asking the right questions, and we are helping our leaders understand what those questions are that need to be asked. So when it comes to decision time, they've got those armed with the right knowledge in order to ask that for that information.
And Greg, over to you. I'm curious what you think on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love Mike's description of cyber professionals as being scrappy, because I do definitely agree with that. We've had an uphill battle as cyber was introduced into technology space, into government. It's a newer space especially in government. So I think part of it is we've always had to fight for funding. We've always had to come up with reasons for why cyber is important and not just a cost center. So I think looking at it from a risk reduction standpoint and telling that story about how doing X will reduce the risk to your municipality, to your government by X percentage. And really telling that story is something that I don't know that as technologists we're always the best at, but I think spinning that conversation to risk reduction is really helpful. And I think our leadership understand risk a little bit more in that space than they do. Buying this widget will do X, Y, and Z, but if you're not spinning it in a risk reduction standpoint, I don't think they understand it as well. So focusing on risk reduction, I think, is a really good thing. And the other thing is, like, if we don't get the funding, there's a lot of things that we can still do. Like, our teams are really great and really resourceful at making use of the technology that we have in place. And if we have to build compensating controls around certain things that instead of buying a new tool that could easily be implemented to reduce that risk, putting in the compensating controls with existing tools that we have in place is a really useful way of ensuring the security of your organization. Ideally, you would get the funding for those tools, but there's always a way to help secure your organization, even if that funding is not there initially or for a short time period in the future.
I want to drill down on that. And we only have a couple minutes left, so we'll kind of wrap up with this question. But I want to drill down on and I don't even know if you you were mentioning it, but ideally, right? When we talk about an ideal world, ideally, cyber funding wouldn't work like this. Ideally, it would be structured to support you in the ways that you need to evolve with the threats, to evolve with the changing landscape. So I guess partially in an ideal world, but also hopefully with some sense of reality. How do we fix this, right? I mean, what would we need to do to make this work in a sustainable way that doesn't require you to be scrappy as much, and does create an environment that's more responsive to what's happening around us? Greg, why don't you go first?
That's the silver bullet question, right? What is the silver bullet to solve this problem? I think continuing to educate our decision makers, our elected officials, as to why cyber is a requirement as opposed to a nice to have. I like to equate it to almost like a public safety service. You don't question about whether you need your police or your fire department within your municipality. So similarly, we provide a public service, we provide safety and security in the digital form. And so thinking of it as a public safety, public service type of function, I think could be a beneficial way of looking at it.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I'm always a big fan and I agree with Greg. Understanding the safety impact and what that looks like is super important. And I think public safety being one of those core components to the way government functions tends to be at least something that's relatable to a lot of our leaders. In general, we have to figure out a way to make sure that our leaders also understand the way that the impact of those the cyber controls and everything are within the environment. Because the one danger that we've got with that the public safety aspect, well, I think they understand it better. Their ability to apply it to scenarios is a lot more difficult, right? Like, it's easy to explain to someone to say, look, I'm going to fund this firehouse is going to cover this these 5,000 homes, right? And that the risk is limited to those 5,000 homes. In the cyber world, it doesn't work like that. You could have something that looks like it's only going to be impacting 100 people, and they use it as a pivot point to all of a sudden impact 100,000 people. So it's really difficult to scope the level of controls down to something where you're absolutely certain that the only impact to something is limited to 100 folks without having all of the security controls in place on the other end, right? So that level of difficulty, where if you don't take a comprehensive cyber approach, it makes it really, really hard to limit the exposure and impact, of a cyber compromise to the environment. Our leaders are always going to struggle to understand that, because it's most of the time we're very focused on the one project or one instance, and it's folks like Greg and myself whose job it is to continually remind folks about where the actual widespread impact is. Now, that said, like, there obviously isn't a silver bullet to it, but getting folks to remember that cyber's got to be part of the equation and not an add-on. It isn't something that's optional, and it can't be something where while we generally try to do a good job of funding our public safety and public response, we know that they are consistently underfunded. We can't live in a world where that's going to continue to happen, generally on both sides, but at least in the cyber side, like, you can't underfund and then expect everything to work correctly. Knowing that technology runs a good portion of the environment, that's where I think the major distinction comes between the public safety argument and where we're at now, is that when public safety stops, it is generally a response-related activity. Somebody isn't there to rescue, respond, protect, whatever. When cybersecurity doesn't work, that solution, that service does not function, right? Something breaks and there's no way to recover it. There's no coming back from it. Like, that is where we're at with a lot of our cyber activity. And that distinction is really important for our leaders to understand and, in theory, embrace. We need them to know that, like, without those cyber components, there is a real high likelihood that we will lose or have restricted services for whatever it is that the government is trying to do, whether that is a museum, water, public safety, or anything else.
Greg and Mike, I have 40 more silver bullet questions for you, but we'll call it there for today. Thanks so much for being a part of this, and thanks for sharing some of that perspective on how we do this and maybe even how we fix it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been great.
And to our audience, stay tuned for so much more from today's Cybersecurity Modernization Summit.